Nurses who think their doctors are the most dangerous people in this building. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 47 minutes before a Black Hawk landed in his parking lot. Seattle General's ER in San Antonio hums under fluorescent lights at 2 a.m., the smell of antiseptic mixing with burned coffee and something underneath it, the copper scent of old blood that no amount of bleach erases. Sarah Chen moves through the controlled chaos with the kind of efficiency that comes from years of compartmentalization. Her scrubs are navy blue, standard issue, but underneath them run scars that tell stories the Pentagon buried 7 years ago. Helmand Province. A field hospital with no walls. 16 lives she pulled back from the threshold, hand steady while mortar fire shook the ground around her. She doesn't talk about it. She doesn't talk about much. A patient in Bay 3 is coding. Sarah hears the monitor flatline, that single high-pitched whine that means someone's heart stopped working, and she's already moving before the resident shouts for help. The boots in her locker, the ones wrapped in plastic on the bottom shelf underneath her spare scrubs, those are from another life. Sarah touches them before every night shift, her palm flat against the aged leather, and says nothing. The boots came with a letter 3 years ago. Her son Danny signed it. Captain Marcus Webb signed it. Webb's handwriting was precise, military neat. Your son showed valor under fire. You should know that. She folded the letter and wore it against her chest for a week before locking it in the same locker as the boots. The night shift at Seattle General is controlled violence. 12 beds. 3 nurses. A rotating cast of residents who haven't learned yet that asking questions saves lives. Sarah has learned not to ask questions. She's learned to watch instead. Watch the vitals. Watch the breathing patterns. Watch the small movements that tell you when someone's heart is about to stop before the machine does. Watch the doctors. Especially watch the doctors. An ambulance pulls up at 2:06 a.m. Unconscious male, late 40s, found collapsed outside the VA clinic on Wurzbach Street. No wallet. No phone. No identification. The paramedics bring him in on a stretcher, his clothes torn at the shoulder, one boot missing. Sarah takes report while moving, her hands already reaching for the oxygen monitor, already checking airway, already scanning for injuries that might explain why he went down. What's his story? She asks the paramedic, a woman named Torres who's been running ambulances in San Antonio for 15 years. Found on the sidewalk at 2:15. Witness said he just collapsed. No seizure activity. No obvious trauma. Could be medical, could be drugs, could be anything. Sarah nods and begins the routine. Vitals. Assessment. She needs his jacket off to check his chest, to look for needle marks or surgical scars that might explain the collapse. The jacket is army issue, tan coyote colored, and when she pulls it free from his unconscious shoulders, something tangles in the lining. A chain. Metal glinting in the harsh fluorescent light. Dog tags. They catch on the fabric, twisted in the jacket's inner pocket like they've been there through countless missions, countless sleeps in places where morning never came soft. Sarah's hands go very still. Not trembling. Not freezing. Still. 1 heartbeat. 2. She untangles the chain with the practiced care of someone who understands what metal tags hanging around a soldier's neck mean. What they weigh. What they're for. The name stamped into the metal runs across her vision, Webb, Marcus A. The service number beneath it. Blood type O positive. Religion, Christian. The tags are old, scuffed where dog tag chains always get scuffed from rubbing against body armor and sweat and desert heat. Captain Marcus Webb. Sarah's jaw tightens. Not noticeable. Not loud. Just the muscle tensing at the hinge of her face, the kind of micro-reaction that someone watching would see if they knew what to look for. She's very good at controlling micro-reactions. She clips the tags back into the chain and places them on the bedside table, then turns her attention to the patient's chest. Baseline EKG. Respiratory status. Heart rate already climbing. 104 beats per minute. Tachycardic. Something's wrong inside him, something the paramedics missed, something she can smell like hunting prey, the faint chemical smell of shock beginning, the subtle shift in skin temperature that tells you the body's already making decisions about where to send blood. Sarah. It's not a request. It's a voice like a tank idling in a garage, all controlled power and barely restrained authority. Dr. Caldwell has appeared the way he always appears, materially, without footsteps, as if the rank and the family name on the hospital's new cardiac wing allow him to displace air itself. He's watching her. She feels the weight of his attention the way you feel a sniper scope, not hot but present, calculating. His white coat is pressed so sharp it could cut. His name is embroidered on the pocket in thread that costs more than her rent. His family donated $2.4 million to this hospital. That's what the plaque in the lobby says. That's what everyone knows. That's why he moves through Seattle General like he owns the breathing space. This one, he asks, but he's not asking about the patient. His eyes are on the dog tags. Unconscious arrival. No ID. Vitals unstable. Sarah's voice is level. Professional. The voice of a night shift nurse in the ER who's seen unconscious arrivals every shift for the last decade. Found with these. She points to the dog tags. Doesn't touch them again. Caldwell picks them up. He reads them the way you read a shipping label on a package. Information. Nothing more. He lets them drop back to the bedside table, and there's a sound, that small clink of metal hitting plastic, that travels through Sarah's spine like feedback. Army, he says. Yes, sir. They have a hospital. Yes, sir. The VA on Wurzbach. Then this isn't a Seattle General problem. He turns to walk away, then pauses. His voice drops, becomes conversational, the kind of casual tone that carries more weight than shouting. You know, nurses who think their doctors are the most dangerous people in this building. They get attached. They see one case and suddenly they're making treatment decisions. Requesting transfers that aren't medically indicated. Slowing down the system. It's a liability. He says it while looking at her, but not at her eyes. At the dog tags. Then he's gone, his shoes clicking against the linoleum in a rhythm that sounds like a countdown. Sarah's hands are already working. 12 lead EKG, the electrodes go on his chest in 6 seconds, her touch efficient and practiced. The machine hums and prints the electrical activity of his heart in a thin black line across paper. The line shows something wrong. Something deep. Arrhythmia. The kind of rhythm that means his heart is beating but not pushing blood effectively. The kind of rhythm that kills you quietly if nobody stops it. She reaches for the 4 kit. 18-gauge needle. Fluid wide open. Blood draw for labs. Her hands move on their own, muscle memory from a place and time she doesn't discuss, doesn't mention, doesn't acknowledge when people ask what brought her to nursing in San Antonio when she's got an accent that sounds like the Pacific Northwest and a way of moving like she's crossed more borders than the passport in her locker shows. The resident arrives, a third-year named Morrison who hasn't learned yet that watching the nurse is faster than reading the textbook. What do we have? Morrison asks, and there's already uncertainty in his voice, the sound of a doctor who knows something's wrong but doesn't know what yet. Possible cardiac event, Sarah says. Heart rate 104 and rising. This EKG shows inferior STEMI pattern. He needs the cath lab. We need to run more tests. No time, Sarah says. And she's not rude about it. Not disrespectful. Just matter of fact, like she's stating the weather. Daughter balloon time is critical with STEMI. His heart's already failing. Every minute we wait, we're killing muscle tissue. Morrison looks at the EKG. He reads it again. Sarah watches his face change as his brain catches up to what the machine already knows. The electrical current of Captain Marcus Webb's heart is dying on paper in front of them, and every second they stand here is another second that muscle isn't getting blood. I'll call the attending, Morrison says, and Sarah has already moved to the next step, preparing the transfer, making sure the monitors are portable, checking that the patient's line is secure. She works with the kind of focused intensity that makes the chaos around her seem to slow down. Time compression. That's what they used to call it in the field. When everything narrows to the single task in front of you. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that when she glanced back at the bedside table, Dr. Caldwell was standing in the doorway of the observation room, watching her over his tablet. And his expression was the expression of a man who'd seen something he didn't like, something that didn't fit the hierarchy, something that made him calculate what would need to happen next to put it back in place. Sarah didn't flinch. She finished securing the patient's line, moved to the monitor readings, checked every detail twice. The dog tags lay on the metal table, catching light. She didn't touch them again. That wasn't her job. Not now. Now her job was keeping Captain Marcus Webb alive long enough to figure out what his body was doing. Long enough for someone in this hospital to recognize that the unconscious man in Bay 2 was a soldier, that he'd already sacrificed things most people couldn't imagine, that he didn't deserve to die on a night shift while a doctor who thought he owned the building decided whether saving him was worth the paperwork. Captain Webb's heart monitor beeped. Once. Twice. The rhythm steadied slightly as the 4 fluids hit his system, as the medication Sarah had already anticipated started working through his veins. It wasn't enough. But it was a start. She moved toward the elevator. Morrison followed. The patient was already being transferred, already rolling toward the cardiac catheterization lab 3 floors up. And Sarah's jaw was still tight, still controlled, still showing nothing of what she felt when she read that name on the dog tags. Still showing nothing of what it meant that the man who wrote letters about her son, letters that kept her tethered to a version of herself she thought she'd left behind, was now connected to her by nothing but proximity and chance and the fact that she was working the night he collapsed. The doors of the cardiac unit opened. Morrison made his calls. Sarah stood back and let the cardiologists take over, the way she always did. The way she was supposed to. And in her pocket, her employee ID badge felt heavier than usual, heavier than the rank she'd buried, heavier than the 7 years of silence and scrubs and night shifts. That was the last time she let anyone tell her what she was allowed to do. The amphitheater of Seattle General held 70 staff members on tiered seats, the kind of space designed to make anyone at ground level feel small. Sarah stood in the back row, arms at her sides, watching Dr. Caldwell pace across the stage with the measured confidence of a man who'd never been questioned inside these walls. His family had endowed the new pediatric wing. His mentor taught at Johns Hopkins. His voice carried the kind of weight that made residents take notes just to look busy. The projector hummed to life behind him. A patient chart appeared on the screen, Captain Marcus Webb's name, his vitals, his imaging. Sarah's chart notes. Caldwell smiled like a man about to make a point that would stick. Let's discuss a textbook example of emotional over-involvement and protocol deviation, Caldwell said, his voice pitched to carry to the back row. He tapped the screen. Nurse Chen here made a critical error in judgment. Look at the timeline. Patient arrives unconscious at 2,200 hours. Initial assessment should take 8 minutes. Vitals, airway, basic labs. Standard protocol. He paused. The room was so still you could hear the fluorescent light's electronic hum. Instead, Nurse Chen spent 17 minutes at bedside before reporting to me. 17 minutes. During which time, the patient's blood pressure dropped from 118/76 to 94/52. You know why. He smiled. She was too busy fondling the patient's jewelry to notice his vital signs degrading. The pause was deliberate. 2 residents smirked. An intern's pen hovered over her notebook. Sarah's jaw tightened. That was all. Just the faintest clench of muscle at the hinge of her face, the kind of movement most people wouldn't catch unless they were looking. She wasn't looking away. She wasn't looking at the ground. Her eye stayed level, fixed on the back wall with the intensity of someone cataloging a target. You see, Caldwell continued, turning back to the screen, some nurses forget they're technicians, not physicians. They see a patient with a certain military background, and suddenly they believe they're field medics. They think their instincts supersede established protocols. He made eye contact with Sarah across the distance. The message was clear. But instinct isn't medicine. Instinct is ego. An ego in an intensive care unit gets people killed. More notes being written. A resident whispered something to her neighbor. Caldwell went through the medical details, standard labs, standard imaging, standard interventions. Everything by the book. Everything that had left Captain Webb stable but unchanged, his prognosis measured in increment rather than recovery. Sarah's hands remained perfectly still at her sides. Hands that had threaded for catheters into shattered veins in a dust storm. Hands that had performed emergency cricothyrotomies with a field knife when the airway was collapsing. Hands that had held 16 soldiers' lives in their palms while helicopters circled overhead. Those hands didn't shake in an air-conditioned amphitheater while a physician who'd never treated combat trauma explained standard care protocols. The presentation ended. Caldwell answered questions from 3 residents, all softball queries about empiric antibiotics and observation periods. Nobody asked about the dog tags. Nobody asked why Nurse Chen had lingered. Nobody asked if she'd seen something in Captain Webb's presentation that warranted closer attention. Sarah left before the coffee service started. An hour later, standing at the vending machine on the 3rd floor, feeding dollar bills into the slot, she heard them coming before they saw her. 2 residents' voices pitched to carry in the quiet hallway during shift change. The kind of voices that wanted an audience even if they claimed otherwise. Chen probably thought dog tags were some kind of medical alert bracelet, one said. Male voice, the kind that laughed easily at other people's expense. Maybe she was looking for the Made in China stamp, the other added. Female voice, younger. The kind of resident who laughed along because that's how you climb the ladder in teaching hospitals. The vending machine dispensed Sarah's coffee with a metallic hiss. She watched it drop into the catch tray, the small mechanical event, the sound of something falling, the momentary silence after. Her hand didn't shake as she retrieved the cup. Her breathing didn't change. She didn't turn around. She didn't acknowledge them. She simply walked past them toward the stairwell, the coffee cup held level in her right hand, her eyes fixed on the corridor ahead. That afternoon, Sarah sat at the computer terminal in the nurse's station and typed a transfer request for Captain Marcus Webb. She cited his need for specialized traumatic brain injury protocols developed specifically for Army Ranger training. She referenced the VA's advanced neurorehabilitation programs, the specialized PTSD and combat trauma units, the 24-hour medical oversight that a community hospital couldn't provide. She used clinical language. She used protocol. She used the kind of precise documentation that made her request sound like it came from concern rather than insubordination. She hit send at 1,547 hours. Dr. Caldwell's office door opened at 1,607 hours. His nurse stood in the hallway, pointing toward him. He'd been waiting for this. "Come in," he said, already standing behind his desk. His office had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the San Antonio skyline, and the afternoon light made him look almost heroic. He kept the office cold, always cold, the kind of temperature that signaled power and control. Sarah stood in the doorway. She didn't sit. "You submitted a transfer request for Captain Webb," Caldwell said. "Not a question." "Yes, doctor. You did this without consulting me." "I consulted the patient's medical needs," Sarah said. Her voice was quiet. Deferential. A nurse speaking to her supervisor. Nothing in her tone suggested she'd spent 3 years coordinating logistics for classified operations across 3 continents. Caldwell's face tightened. "You will not question my medical decisions. You will not contact outside facilities about my patients. You will not bypass my authority. If you do any of these things again, security will escort you from this building and I will personally ensure that every hospital in this state knows you're a liability." He paused, letting the threat settle. "Do I make myself clear?" Sarah nodded once. "Yes, "Doctor." She turned toward the door. "And Sarah," he called out as her hand touched the frame. "I'm documenting this conversation in your file. Just so there's no confusion later about who violated protocol." The door closed so gently it didn't make a sound. No anger in the closure. No drama. Just the soft whisper of wood-meeting frame, the kind of quiet that men like Caldwell never learned to fear because quiet was what came before things changed. Sarah moved through the rest of her shift with the mechanical efficiency of someone whose body had been trained to operate independently from her mind. Medications, vitals, documentation. The standard rhythms of a night shift nurse. Captain Webb slept fitfully in ICU bed 4, his chart showing stable vitals and no change in neurological status. She checked on him during her 2,100 rounds, noted the faint distension of his jugular vein, the barely perceptible muffling of his heart sounds through her stethoscope, the subtle cooling of his extremities that suggested fluid redistribution. She documented everything in the nursing notes. Clear, precise, clinical language. No interpretations. No recommendations. Just facts for any physician to read. Caldwell's response appeared in the chart within hours. Nurse Chen continues to exceed her scope of practice. Disregard. Sarah had been disregarded by better men than him. The kind of men who commanded platoons. The kind of men who'd written her performance evaluations in classified reports that would never be declassified. The kind of men who understood that sometimes being disregarded by people who didn't matter was exactly where you needed to be. She worked her third consecutive shift the following night, the kind of back-to-back that leaves your vision slightly blurred and your reflexes operating on something closer to muscle memory than conscious thought. 18 hours of accumulated fatigue sitting behind her eyes like an old injury. But muscle memory from field hospitals in Helmand Province never really left your body. It lived in your hands. It lived in your ability to see patterns that others missed. It lived in the calm that came from having already survived things worse than anything that could happen in a temperature-controlled American hospital. The third shift had bled into the fourth somewhere around 2 a.m., and Sarah's vision had started doing that thing where the fluorescent ceiling lights left traces when she moved her eyes. 36 hours without real sleep. Her hands knew the work anyway. Muscle memory didn't require consciousness, just repetition, and she had 23 years of that. Palpating a radial pulse. Scanning vital signs. Adjusting for flow rates in the dark spaces of her hands before her brain registered what she'd done. This was the gift of being broken incorrectly. Your body became a tool that functioned independent of exhaustion. Captain Marcus Webb had been stable for 14 hours. Systolic holding steady at 118. O2 sat consistent at 97 on 2 liters nasal cannula. His chest rose and fell with the mechanical rhythm of a man who'd learned to sleep in places where sleep killed you. Sarah had checked on him 4 times during her shift, each time noting the slight pallor that didn't quite match his stable numbers, the way his respirations had ticked up from 16 to 18 breaths per minute, the almost imperceptible beading of sweat along his hairline that didn't match the temperature of the ICU bay. Numbers were lies sometimes. The body told the truth if you knew how to read it. Dr. Caldwell wasn't reading anything except the ultrasound screen, and he was reading it wrong. He'd done the cardiac echo himself at 4:37 a.m., hand steady with the confidence of a man who'd never had his diagnosis questioned successfully. Sarah had watched from the doorway, not hovering, not inserting herself, just standing close enough to see the grayscale bloom of Webb's heart filling the monitor. The ejection fraction looked acceptable. Valve movement normal. All the textbook markers of a man recovering well from his initial trauma. Caldwell had nodded, made a note, and left her to manage the patient's ongoing care with the kind of dismissal that felt like a favor, as if he'd done her a service by not mentioning her earlier insubordination. What he'd missed was the pressure building in the pericardial sac. It was subtle, a millimeter of fluid that shouldn't have been there, not visible on the cursory echo, only detectable if someone was looking for signs of tamponade instead of looking for permission to leave. Sarah had seen this exact progression twice, once in a trauma tent outside Marja and once in a medevac hospital in Kandahar. Fluid accumulates. Pressure builds. The heart gets squeezed like a fist closing around an already overtaxed organ. Then the cascade happens. Then death arrives in 90 seconds, looking like a man watching his monitor in shock. Webb's systolic pressure dropped from 118 to 108 at 5:14 a.m. It wasn't a gradual decline. It was a plummet, the kind that meant something had shifted, something fundamental had changed in the architecture of his cardiovascular system. Sarah was at his bedside when it happened, checking the foresight because instinct had been screaming at her for the past 3 hours that something wasn't right. She'd learned to trust that voice. It had kept her alive in places where hesitation was a terminal diagnosis. By 5:16, his pressure was 94/55. By 5:18, it was 78/48. By 5:20, it was 60/35, and Captain Webb's lips were turning the particular shade of blue that meant his heart was working with nothing, pumping blood through vessels that couldn't receive it, oxygen saturation dropping like a stone in dark water. The monitor alarm didn't just sound, it shrieked, that continuous sonic wall that meant the system had detected a life-ending emergency. Sarah's hand moved to the call button without thought, but she was already moving toward Webb's checking the lines, looking for the obvious first, the line clot or the infiltrate, the thing that would kill him if it wasn't immediately obvious. There was no obvious thing. The alarm was a metal sound, relentless and urgent. The kind that made everyone in the unit move faster. Caldwell came running, and Sarah saw something flicker across his face, the moment his brain caught up to the numbers on the monitor. He went directly to the ultrasound, his hands moving with the same steady confidence they'd had 4 hours earlier, except now those hands were shaking. Subtle. Controlled. But shaking the way hands shake when their owner has just realized they've made a mistake that's about to kill someone in front of witnesses. 2 other nurses materialized, Marcus from bed 3, Elena from the charge desk, and both of them looked at Sarah with the kind of clarity that comes from knowing you're in a dying patient situation and the person running the code isn't reading the situation right. Caldwell was staring at the ultrasound screen like it might rewrite itself if he stared hard enough. He was frozen the way first-year residents freeze, the way people freeze when they realize the textbook they studied doesn't match the human body in front of them. He'd learned this procedure from a diagram. Sarah had learned it from Gunnery Sergeant Reynolds in a sandstorm with mortars walking up the valley toward their position. The code team would be 90 seconds away. Maybe more, depending on where they were in the hospital. That was 80 seconds too long for a heart being crushed by its own fluid. Sarah opened the pericardiocentesis kit, the one that shouldn't have been opened, the one she wasn't authorized to use, the one Caldwell had already threatened her about once, and her hands moved through the preparation sequence with the muscle memory of an operator who'd done this procedure on 19 different patients, 14 of them in active combat zones where infection control meant don't let the wound touch the ground. She prepped the site with betadine in smooth concentric circles, her movements economical and precise, the kind of precision that comes from having already survived things worse than an ER director's career. Caldwell found his voice somewhere between panic and authority. "If you touch that patient, I will have you arrested." Sarah didn't respond. Didn't pause. Didn't acknowledge. She palpated the xiphoid process, found the anatomical landmark her hands had memorized in a place that didn't exist on any map, and measured the angle with her fingers, the same way she'd measured it in lamplight with bombs falling outside the hospital tent. The needle went in with the precision of a surgeon's laser, between the ribs, through the pericardium, into the space where fluid was strangling Captain Webb's heart. The syringe connected and she pulled back. Blood-tinged fluid. The color of old iron and betrayed protocol. 50 milliliters. The pressure in Webb's chest dropped immediately. 75 milliliters. His lips started returning to their proper color. The monitor alarm stopped its shriek mid-wail, leaving a silence so profound that every person in the ICU bay could hear the ventilators breathing for their patients, 1 bay over, 2 bays over, the sound of people being kept alive while someone decided if they wanted to keep working here. Sarah withdrew the needle and applied pressure with sterile gauze. The entire sequence, from alarm to salvation, had taken 47 seconds. Webb's systolic pressure was climbing, 72. 84, 91. His color was good. His O2 sat was returning to normal. The danger had passed, which meant the reckoning was about to begin. Caldwell's face went through a rapid cycle of white, then the particular shade of red that means a man has just watched his competence evaporate in front of witnesses. He opened his mouth, closed it. Then, with the precision of someone reading a script he'd been waiting to use since the moment she'd requested Webb's transfer, he said the words that would end her career by sunrise. "You're done here. Security." The code team arrived 43 seconds later, which was 20 seconds too late to matter. They took over Webb's care, checked the pericardiocentesis site, reviewed the ultrasound, confirmed that the tamponade had been successfully drained and documented the improvement in cardiac output. They looked at the chart. They looked at Sarah. They looked at Caldwell, whose hands were now completely still because he'd put them in his pockets, which meant he was concentrating very hard on not letting them betray how badly he wanted to throw something. The entire unit knew what had happened. They'd watched it unfold. They'd seen the moment when an ER director's authority had become less important than a patient's heartbeat. But what they knew and what they could prove in the current structure were two different things, and Dr. Caldwell had spent his entire career learning how to navigate the gap between those two concepts. By 6:17 a.m., Sarah's badge had been deactivated. By 6:43 a.m., she'd removed her stethoscope from around her neck and placed it in her empty locker, the one that had contained her entire professional identity for the last 5 years, 2 sets of scrubs, a pair of compression socks, and the dog tag she'd taken from Captain Webb's jacket to clean the blood off before his family arrived. The dog tags were cold in her pocket. Caldwell had made his phone calls by morning, and he'd made them with the certainty of a man who understood how power actually worked. First call, to the board president, who'd had a daughter born at Seattle General 15 years ago, breach presentation, emergency rotation, complication-free delivery, debt that accumulated interest. Second call, to a board member who'd had his appendix removed by Caldwell in a private surgery that had gone much more smoothly than it should have, which meant favors were owed. Third call, to another board member whose wife's father Caldwell had managed through end-of-life care with the kind of discretion that meant certain conversations would never appear in medical records. Fourth call, to the State Nursing Licensing Board, a formal complaint describing dangerous cowboy medicine practiced by an insubordinate nurse with a hero complex, words that had weight because Caldwell knew how to make words carry weight. The complaint was copied to his mentor at Johns Hopkins, the man who championed his career, who believed in him, who would read those words and feel personally betrayed. The florist across the street from Seattle General didn't usually deliver at 7 a.m., but they made an exception when the order came with a note that said, "Thank you for everything, Chief." Sarah sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, staring at the arrangement of white roses and blue cornflowers like they were written in a language she'd forgotten how to read. The fluorescent lights of the 24-hour diner buzzed like angry insects, the kind of sound that burrowed into your skull after you'd been awake for 43 hours. Sarah sat in a booth with a perfect view of the parking lot and the pre-dawn darkness beyond, the kind of darkness that swallowed hope. The coffee in front of her had formed a skin on its surface, an oily membrane that caught the sickly yellow light. She stared into it like it was telling her something. Her reflection stared back, hollow-eyed, cheekbones too sharp, jaw locked the way it got when she was holding something dangerous inside. She looked like a woman who had already died and didn't know it yet. The phone sat face down on the laminate table, its buzzing still vibrating through her fingertips even though it had stopped 2 minutes ago. She knew what the message said without reading it. Suspension. Effective immediately. Pending investigation by the State Board of Nursing. Surrender of credentials and badge by 0800 hours. The language was clinical, efficient, the way bureaucracy dismantled people, one cold sentence at a time. Possible criminal charges for practicing medicine without a license. That was the knife twist. Caldwell had called it dangerous cowboy medicine while Captain Webb was still on the ventilator, before his oxygen levels stabilized to 89%, before anyone could say the word hero. The ER director had stood over her like a man watching a problem be removed. By morning, the calls had started. 3 board members who owed Caldwell's family favors, old money with older obligations. She'd overheard Rodriguez mention it at shift change. The man had integrity, had actually served, and his voice had carried a tone of disgust. Emails had followed. The nursing director received one at 6:48 a.m. describing Sarah's actions as reckless intervention outside scope of practice, the kind of language designed to make a compassionate decision sound like a crime. There was a formal complaint filed with the state licensing board, copied to Caldwell's mentor at Johns Hopkins Medical, a man with enough institutional power to end careers with a single conversation. Caldwell had built his empire on favors and bloodlines, and he was cashing every one of them in. The waitress refilled her coffee without asking, an older woman whose name tag read Diane, whose eyes had seen enough hard living to recognize it in others. "You good, honey?" she asked, not really expecting an answer. Sarah nodded once. Diane didn't push. People in diners at 3 in the morning understood that some silences were necessary. 36 years ago, Sarah Chen had joined the Navy because she wanted to disappear into something larger than herself. At 22, she'd been pulled into the 160th SOAR Special Operations Support Division, then faster, deeper, into things that didn't have names. She'd learned to move through darkness like it was water. She'd learned that pain was information and fear was just another vital sign to monitor. She'd learned to keep people alive in places that wanted them dead. And after 12 years, after Operation Sandstorm had been run in a valley in Helmand Province that the Pentagon had scrubbed from every map, she'd been told to cease existing. Not retire. Cease. The records were sealed. The operation was classified so deep that even asking about it was a federal crime. They'd given her a new social security number, a nursing license, and orders to be invisible. Be small. Don't surface. The 40 insurgents they'd eliminated in that operation couldn't testify about what they'd seen. But they'd given her a way to help. Nursing. Healing. It was like painting a picture with only grey paint, a life without color, without recognition, but purposeful. For 7 years, she'd been a ghost in scrubs. She'd earned commendations she couldn't acknowledge. She'd saved lives whose families would never know her name. She'd been nothing, which meant she was safe. Nothing couldn't be targeted. Nothing couldn't lose security clearances or be court-martialed. Nothing couldn't betray the memory of Marines who died because the operation's existence was still being denied. Until Captain Marcus Webb had arrived unconscious in her trauma bay. She reached into her locker, already half-emptied, her personal things stuffed into a canvas bag, and found the dog tags. They lay in her palm, warm from body heat she'd left them with. Captain Webb's name stamped into brass. His blood type. His service number. She'd cleaned them carefully before his family arrived, using sterile gauze and distilled water to remove the blood that had transferred from her hands during the emergency pericardiocentesis. The needle had gone between his ribs so precisely that she could feel the resistance of tissue giving way, the moment the pressure released, the moment she'd saved his life. He'd been Danny's commanding officer for 3 years. He'd written her letters about her son's progress, letters forwarded through channels that no longer existed, to an identity that had been legally erased. Danny didn't know his mother was alive. Danny thought she'd died in a training accident in 2017, which was what the Pentagon had told him. It was simpler that way. It kept him safe. She'd kept the dog tags because for 3 years, they were the only tangible proof that the man who kept her son alive existed. The coffee had gone cold. Outside, a helicopter passed overhead, maybe 3 miles out, rotors thumping the pre-dawn air in a rhythm that sounded like a heart that had forgotten how to stop. Sarah didn't look up. She turned the dog tags over in her hands, reading the stamped letters by the sickly fluorescent light. Captain Marcus Webb. Son of a preacher from Georgia. The man who told her son that honor meant something, that leadership meant you died before your people did, that loyalty wasn't a choice, it was a blood oath. She'd saved his life because of the letters. She'd saved his life because staying invisible had cost her everything, and she could at least ensure that Danny's commander, the man who cared for her son in the places she couldn't go, would live to see him come home. And now she'd burned the only identity she had left. Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen didn't exist. That woman had been classified so deeply that the Pentagon denied she'd ever lived. But Sarah the nurse, the invisible woman in scrubs who showed up for 12-hour shifts and never asked for recognition, had stopped existing 48 hours ago when she put a needle between a man's ribs and drew out the fluid that was suffocating his heart. Caldwell had made sure of it. He'd suspended her from the hospital, filed complaints with the state, activated a network of favors that probably included people she'd never meet, all because she'd done something that saved a life and made him look small in front of his staff. She reached into her pocket and felt the weight of the dog tags. They sat heavy against her hip, solid and warm, a reminder of something the Pentagon had ordered her to forget. Some people were worth breaking cover for. Some people deserved to live, even if it meant ceasing to exist. Outside, the sun was starting to think about rising. In a few hours, Rodriguez would be relieved from his shift. Caldwell would arrive for morning rounds, probably feeling victorious, the problem of Sarah Chen solved. Webb would be somewhere in the hospital, healing, probably thinking about home, about Danny, about the woman who'd saved his life in the dark. And Sarah would be in her apartment, staring at credentials she could no longer use, wondering if 7 years of being invisible had been practice for this, being nobody again, and this time without even a uniform to hide behind. The waitress came by with the check. Sarah left cash, more than she owed, because Diane had let her sit for 3 hours without complaint. The woman looked at her once more, that look that said she knew something bad had happened. Sarah didn't correct her. She walked out into the pre-dawn air, and the helicopter sound was gone now, replaced only by the distant hum of a city waking up to the day. She was carrying the dog tags in her pocket like a confession, like a secret that would eventually destroy her, like the only honest thing she'd done in 7 years. The suspension notice had used words like investigation and pending and possible criminal charges. But what it really meant was that Sarah Chen the nurse was finished. She'd been allowed to be invisible only as long as she stayed small. The moment she'd saved a life and stepped into the light, the walls had closed. Caldwell had made sure of it. He'd called it dangerous medicine, called it outside protocol, called it the action of someone who didn't know her place. What he'd really said, if you listened to the silence under his words, was that invisible people who stepped into the light got erased. She'd spent 7 years trying to disappear. Now she was getting her wish. The Black Hawk landed at 14:36 hours. Rotors screaming. Car alarms triggered in the parking lot 3 blocks away. The wind shear shattered a light fixture above the emergency bay entrance, glass falling like rain on hot asphalt. The rotor wash hit the ER doors so hard they kicked inward, and every monitor in the trauma bay flickered in unison. Sarah was restocking a crash cart when the sound hit, that particular percussion of military-grade turbines that only people who've lived beneath them truly recognize. Her hands went still. That was not a flight for life from Houston. That was something else entirely. 2 figures emerged from the rotor wash. Army Rangers in full combat gear. Multicam uniforms pristine. Patches on their shoulders reading 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, a dark horse. They moved through the automatic doors like they owned the air around them, boots striking tile with the kind of purpose that made the ER nurses step sideways without being asked. The taller one approached the registration desk, and his voice carried the flat, precise clarity of someone accustomed to being heard over helicopter noise. "We're looking for Phantom. Navy nurse. Master Chief rank. She works nights. Where is she?" The room didn't so much go quiet as it inverted. Every conversation stopped. Every monitor seemed louder. The registration clerk opened her mouth, closed it, looked toward the back hallway where Sarah stood motionless beside a defibrillator that suddenly seemed very far away. Rodriguez, the night security guard, a former Marine who'd spent 15 years in the motor pool before his knees gave out, came around the corner just as the 2nd Ranger scanned the ER. Rodriguez was 62, diabetic, walked with a cane, and had never raised his voice in all the months he'd worked at Seattle General. He went rigid. Actually went rigid, the way people do when they recognize something they haven't seen in decades. His spine straightened. His cane came up. "That's Master Chief Petty Officer Chen," Rodriguez announced. His voice had changed. Not louder. Sharper. The voice he'd probably used at 29 Palms and Camp Lejeune. "Son, you'd better show some goddamn respect." The assembled staff, nurses, residents, the janitor, the blood bank tech, turned to stare at Sarah, who had not moved. She was still holding a bag of normal saline and a box of endotracheal tubes. Her expression had not changed. Her composure was a wall. But every muscle in her body had reset to a frequency they couldn't see. Dr. James Caldwell came out of the physician's lounge at that exact moment, coffee cup in hand, because the universe has a sense of timing. His face was the color of old yogurt when he saw the Rangers and the words Master Chief and the way the ER had reorganized itself around the recognition of rank. His coffee cup lowered. He understood, in the way a drowning man understands the weight of water, that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. He had spent 3 days constructing a formal complaint to the state licensing board about a nurse he'd publicly described as emotionally involved and dangerous. He had called his mentor at Johns Hopkins Medical and described her as an insubordinate who'd overstepped her authority and delayed proper care. He had activated every institutional protection he possessed, family donations, board connections, the implicit threat of his father's endowed wing against someone whose actual authority existed on a scale he couldn't measure. The second ranger moved toward the back hallway where Captain Marcus Webb's room was. But the first ranger remained, and he held up a tablet. A 2-star general stood beside him, visible on video, because someone at Fort Sam Houston had authorized this in writing, and began to read. His voice was clipped, military, official. Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. Navy Cross. Bronze Star with Valor. Second Bronze Star with Valor. Third Bronze Star with Valor. Architect and Field Commander of Operation Sandstorm, a classified joint special operations mission that resulted in the confirmed safe extraction of 200 coalition personnel from hostile territory. A pause. Captain Marcus Webb was among those personnel extracted. So was Chief Petty Officer Daniel Chen, the subject's son. Both personnel owe their continued existence to the tactical decisions and field leadership of Master Chief Chen. Webb came through his room door on his own power, no stretcher, though he should have been horizontal for at least another 48 hours. He was moving like a man who'd been cleared for duty, and his eyes found Sarah immediately, locked onto her the way trained warriors recognize other trained warriors. He was still in a hospital gown because protocol, but his bearing had straightened, his shoulders had reset, and when he spoke, his voice carried the precision of a man addressing a superior officer. "Dan is alive because you taught me what real leadership looks like, Chief," he said. The words were simple. The truth beneath them was structural. He meant that her son had survived Helmand Province because she had trained Webb to lead men, to make decisions under fire, to keep people alive when the odds suggested otherwise. He meant that Sarah Chen's sacrifice had created a chain of preservation that had saved her own son. The silence lasted exactly 10 seconds. Sarah counted them. She'd counted silences like this before, in places where 10 seconds could mean the difference between extraction and body bag. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their mechanical drone. The monitors beeped their steady confirmation of continued existence. And somewhere in that silence, every person in the Seattle General Emergency Room understood that they had been discussing one of the most decorated operators in the modern military as if she were an administrative inconvenience. Rodriguez's cane tapped once against the tile floor. That was all. Just one confirmation of witnessed reality. Caldwell's face had progressed from yogurt-colored to a shade that suggested active circulatory compromise. His coffee cup was still raised, frozen mid-gesture, and his eyes had acquired the quality of a man watching his entire career reorganize itself into a different configuration. The mentor he'd called, the man at Johns Hopkins who'd written his recommendation letters, was about to learn that his protégé had spent 3 days systematically attacking a decorated officer of the United States Navy. The hospital's PR director, watching from the hallway, had already pulled out her phone. She knew what was coming. She'd worked in institutional communications long enough to recognize the precise moment when something became a liability. She was already thinking about lawyers and damage control. But it was too late. Someone had already filmed Caldwell's Grand Rounds humiliation from 3 angles. Someone had already uploaded the footage to a military nursing forum at 16:13 that afternoon. By 18:23, it had been reposted to Reddit. By 22:15, it had hit TikTok with the caption, "Surgeon publicly mocks nurse for fondling dog tags, she's actually a Navy Cross recipient." By midnight, it had been viewed 180,000 times. By dawn, it would break 400,000 views. The military community moved fast when it came to protecting their own. Dr. Richard Pemberton, the mentor, the man who'd built Caldwell's career from medical school forward, watched the video in his office at Johns Hopkins at 11:13 p.m. He watched it again at 11:49 p.m. Then he made a phone call to the board chairman of Seattle General's hospital system. His voice was measured, which made it worse. "I'm Dr. Richard Pemberton from Johns Hopkins. I trained James Caldwell. I wrote letters that got him every meaningful position he's held. And I'm calling to express my profound disappointment in a physician who dishonours the profession I've served for 43 years. You will conduct a thorough and immediate review of his patient care standards, or I will make my views public through channels that will end his career within 6 months. Is that clear?" It was clear. It became abundantly clear within the next 4 hours. The board chairman, the same one who dismissed 2 previous complaints about Caldwell because of family endowment money, suddenly found himself receiving calls from the Military Affairs Liaison Office at the Pentagon. Not threats. Just conversations. Just reminders that federal funding for graduate medical education programs could be affected by institutional oversight failures. Just suggestions that a thorough investigation might be valuable. Caldwell's 3 board allies, the ones he'd called to activate his network, stopped returning his calls. The calls went to voicemail at first, then they didn't ring through at all. His father's endowed wing didn't protect him when the director of the hospital's Veteran Health Initiative opened an investigation into care protocols. The state nursing board closed its review of Sarah Chen within 20 hours, not because of hospital intervention but because of a phone call from a Pentagon legal office that officially didn't exist, from a division that didn't have a name in any public directory. The suspension notice arrived at Caldwell's home via courier on the morning of day 3. Pending review of patient care standards and physician oversight protocols. His wife watched him read it. She watched him understand, truly understand, that every institutional protection he'd constructed had been built on the assumption that the person he was attacking was powerless. She watched him realize that cruelty recorded on video operates under different rules than cruelty whispered in conference rooms. Sarah declined the hospital's offer to return to Seattle General. They extended it twice with increasing salary and benefits. She declined both times. The VA hospital in San Antonio called instead, the same facility where Rodriguez had mentioned he had cousins working in administration. They offered her a clinical coordinator position, responsible for emergency medicine protocols, starting salary of $118,000 annually, benefits that included tuition assistance for her son's college education. She accepted on the call. She was done with invisibility, not because she wanted recognition but because there was nothing left to hide from anymore. She'd spent 7 years pushing water uphill, maintaining a persona that had no history, no connections, no weight. One pericardiocentesis had shattered that construction. One act of saved life had detonated her cover. And standing in that ER, watching a 2-star general read her decorations aloud while a former Marine confirmed her rank, something had shifted in her center of gravity. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was done wanting to be. If Danny was coming home from Helmand Province because she'd trained Webb to keep him alive, then Danny deserved to know what his mother actually was. He deserved to know what she'd sacrificed to disappear. 6 months later, Sarah stood at San Antonio International Airport in dress whites. Her Navy Cross was visible on her chest, not hidden beneath scrubs and compulsion. Captain Webb stood beside her in his Ranger uniform, fully recovered, cleared for active duty, waiting for the same flight that would bring her son through the arrivals gate. Danny's transport from Germany touched down at 2 p.m. hours precisely. When he came through the gate, he was moving with a slight limp, but he was moving, alive, whole, carrying pieces of Helmand Province in his eyes the way soldiers do, and he saw her uniform before he saw her face. "Mom," he said, confused in the way children get when their parents suddenly become something unrecognizable. Master Chief, Webb corrected gently. Always was. Sarah pulled her son into an embrace, and for the first time since Helmand Province, the iron cage around her chest loosened. Rodriguez had texted her that morning a news article with a photo. Dr. James Caldwell, formerly of Seattle General Hospital's Emergency Medicine Department, now taught CPR certification courses at San Antonio Community College for $18 per hour. The photo showed him demonstrating chest compressions on a rubber dummy to teenagers checking their phones. None of them looked particularly impressed. Sarah didn't smile when she read it. She simply closed the article and turned back to her son. Later, at her apartment, Danny saw the shadow box on the wall, the combat boots she'd hidden in her locker for 7 years, the ones Webb had sent her after Helmand Province when she'd had to become invisible, now displayed with her dog tags and her decorations and a unit photo she'd never been able to throw away. He understood everything he'd never been allowed to know. "You've been invisible," he said quietly. "Had to be," Sarah replied. "Not anymore." Webb raised his beer that night. The three of them gathered around her kitchen table like a family that had finally stopped pretending to be something less. "To visibility," he said. Sarah touched her glass to his. "True class is what you do when the lights go out. Turns out I'm done with the dark. If you're watching this right now, I want you to do something. Subscribe to this channel. There are stories like Sarah's everywhere, waiting to be told. Like the video, because visibility matters. And comment, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value? Share your story. Because the quiet ones, the ones nobody notices, sometimes they're the ones holding everything together.